Are you often disappointed with the way your trees turn out? Do they end up looking a bit lumpy, a bit flat, maybe a bit cartoon-like, without the sense of realism that you'd like them to have? They take forever to draw and they never look any good. I think for many of us, the answer lies in changing the way we think and the way we observe. I found that doing that, I was able to create quite an effective representation of a tree that had a sense of realism even when it was very simple. If it was slightly less simple, this same approach, this changing my thinking, still worked. It worked for really quite different types of trees as well. But even if the trees became a little bit larger or more complex, if they weren't such an obvious shape, and again, with different types of trees, I found that my way of thinking enabled me really to capture any tree pretty much the same as any other tree. And it wasn't a time-consuming process either. Even when the tree was the main subject and there was quite a lot of attention on it, this way of thinking, I believe, gave very effective results and really captured a sense of realism. And it worked just as well when the trees weren't the only subject, but they were what I like to think of as support acts in particularly an urban landscape or even a rural landscape, whether they were close or further away, whether they were not so much trees but just shrubby scrubland, whether it was just a cameo appearance in one part of our drawing, domesticated plants for that matter, whether they were relatively close, whether they were grass, or whether they were further away and then were moving very far away. And I found this way of thinking enabled me to capture realistic trees, even with quite difficult ones, such as these three palms. The same principle, the same way of thinking. Let me explain first what I think the problem way of thinking is, and if this is the way you approach trees, then make sure you stay watching and find out how I approach thinking about trees, which enables me to draw them effectively and I think with a good result. When I see trees drawn looking more like this, I think the problem is that when the person who's drawn it has looked at the trees, they've simply been overwhelmed with what they've seen. They've been overwhelmed with the amount of detail that they have to draw. And what's happened is they've begun to try and create something of what they're seeing with the leaves, a feeling that somehow I should be drawing lots of leaves. But how it ends up is often looking more like this, with some sort of pattern that goes basically over the entire tree canopy. And often they end up looking fairly similar because really the same technique is used. Because when we're overwhelmed with what we're seeing, it's easy to fall back into the same approach. So what's a better way to think? More helpful, I think, than trying to see the detail in our tree, which is lots and lots of tiny leaves everywhere. And for that matter, lots of tiny sticks and twigs and branches. The more helpful approach is actually to not see the detail, if at all possible, but to pull our eyes back slightly and to see and focus on, and then to try and draw the larger components. Now, when I draw, I like to draw closest things first. And when I look at this tree, I think these bunches of canopy here are the closest ones. So I'm looking at drawing this bunch. Now, as far as I can see, if we're generalizing, we don't get a hard, smooth line, but we get a bit of a jagged, ruffled effect. But it's generally smoother at the top than the leaves that are hanging down at the bottom, particularly with the Australian eucalyptus trees, which are the ones I end up drawing the most living in Australia. And then I look to see, with this, how does the shadow go? Where is there shade and shadow? I'm in fact going to now represent the shape by using the lights and darks, by using the values. Now I'll move on to this one here. And I'm speeding up the sections when I'm drawing but not speaking to double time. If I'm speaking, then you're watching me do the drawing at real time. So I'm drawing this section here right now, if you're wondering. Now, I'm not drawing it exactly. I am being fairly gestural and approximate because that's the beauty of this approach. But it's all to do with how I think. I'm not looking at leaves. I'm working hard not to see the leaves, but to see the overall structure, and particularly the parts that are closer. At this point, it can be helpful to add some branches. This small bunch of leaves is further back, so I'm going to make it a bit darker to help show that. I'm now drawing this section over here. At this point, I'm really not thinking of trees or foliage at all. I'm just looking at these dark values and I'm thinking I need to create those dark values with my hatching. Now, at this point, it's easy to lose touch a little with what we're actually drawing compared to the reference. But of course, that's not important. We're not doing a portrait of the tree. We're capturing the effect of the tree. Now, I usually draw the foliage before I commit to the trunks. But it is good to have a sense of where the ground's going to be, which I think in this case is, look, from there to there is about the same. So from there to there. So probably the ground level is down here somewhere. Now for these shrubby things at the base, it's the same principle. I observe not the leaves, but the shape, the overall form, the 3 dimensions, and the shadows that create it. And I try and use marks that still give some indication of the underlying form, although that's not always possible to be too exact. Again, I'm not trying to draw grass. I'm just trying to see the shadows and the values and something of the edges, and trying to just find marks that capture this. I'm not thinking leaves or even plants at all, particularly at this point. Now, because this is a very fast drawing, I'm using larger lines and larger marks for a relatively small photo of a reasonably large tree, which does mess with the effect of the scale of my drawing a little bit. But I think it demonstrates the principle as we start to see a tree emerge that in some ways captures a sense of realism. Even though it's not a literal interpretation of what we're seeing, we've creatively used marks to capture the effect of what we're seeing in just over 10 minutes real time for this. And I think we get a nice effect when we do some negative space to highlight some of the branches that we have. One of the biggest challenges I find in drawing trees is not to let them become too much the same all over. It's to get a randomness rather than a uniformity. It's easy if we don't pay attention to fill in all the gaps and lose the visual distinctiveness of the tree. Unless the tree does naturally have, of course, a very even structure. Well, we haven't really drawn this section of the tree, so I'll just do that quickly now. You'll notice that by starting at the top with my branches, I avoid the problem much more easily of having branches going up into the canopy that end up being too thick for the distance they have to change from being a thick branch to a twig just under the leaf line. Again, some dark value areas to represent foliage that's further back. Now, this is a very rough and ready drawing, but you can imagine that with more time and with a little slower pace, that we could draw quite an effective representation of a tree using it. So my way of thinking again is to not try and see the tree in detail, not to see all the parts and then to try and draw them quite literally on our paper, which is overwhelming. It's instead to pull back and see the big picture of the various parts of this object. And then to work out the best way we can capture that ourselves. This technique works really well when we have a lot of different trees in the one scene, and where it's important to be able to differentiate through our technique, whether we're looking at a clipped hedge or whether there are fir trees or pine trees, just shrubby trees. It's an approach that works well when we have very high contrast with lots of details. Obviously, this takes a lot longer to draw than this, but the approach works just as well to see the effect of lights and darks and shapes and seek to represent them, to draw the effect of those on my paper rather than trying to draw every leaf. It also works well when the scene is very busy and very compressed with lots of different foliage types, to be able to create distinction not just between different types of trees, but the depth at which we're seeing them, particularly when they go from very close to very distant and absolutely every spot in between. So if we come back to our original, perhaps overly literal and not very successful attempt to draw trees, here is a second take on the same scene. When we aim to draw the effect of what we see, it ends up being, not surprisingly, much more effective than if we're somehow trying to overly literally represent overwhelming detail and then we start to reduce it to a pattern or a texture that ends up neither looking real nor three-dimensional. Trees are a great subject to draw, and they don't have to be difficult if we learn to pull back and see the overall visual effect of what we're seeing, and then find marks that don't draw a tree, but that capture the effect of what we're seeing. And if you're interested in more on this, I have a playlist with dozens and dozens of videos. In fact, every one of those tree drawings I've shown you has pretty much a whole video attached to it. So I hope this has been helpful for you. And if it has, please hit the like button for me and let me know in the comments. But whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.